Hello and welcome to the last video in the monitor breeding series. In this video, I'll be talking about the incubation of monitor eggs. I know a lot of you have been patiently waiting for this video, and although it's likely to be a long video, it isn't, in my opinion, as important a video as many people think it's going to be. And the reason for that is a point I had made earlier on in this series, which I will reiterate now, and that is this. If you've been paying attention while watching this series, and set up a good nesting area as discussed in episode 3, and the female then went on to nest really well, as explained in episode 8, you should have no problems incubating the eggs. Good eggs are extremely hardy and very forgiving. I've had eggs cope with extreme drops in temperature during a power outage in the middle of winter, extreme peaks in temperature during a heat wave in the middle of summer, and I've even dropped a couple of eggs and caught them on the first bounce, as though I was playing a game of jacks. I've never had a problem hatching eggs. I've also had a lot of conversations with other monitor breeders over the years, both online and in person, so when I do mention potential problems, it's mainly through seeing patterns with people posting information about their successes and failures over the years and quizzing them about the details. That being said, I'll walk you through techniques I have used over the years to incubate monitor eggs and what I find works best and why. I'll cover some simple ways to make an incubator, different ways to set up the eggs, and what to look for while incubating the eggs. Unfortunately, due to the correlation of some incubation techniques with particular egg issues, the video is not going to run in this tidy chronological order, but will jump back and forth between incubation techniques and egg development issues. Let's start by collecting the eggs first, because until we do that, we have nothing to incubate. When we last left off in videos 8 and 9, the female had laid the eggs, sealed the nest, and may have started to defend the nest against potential predators. As I'd mentioned in video 8, after the female has laid the eggs and sealed the nest, it's best to wait until the female has stopped anything that looks like backfilling or any nesting-related activity before collecting the eggs. I tend to wait until the following morning before collecting them. The nest defense behavior shown by some female monitors tends to be aimed at other monitors rather than at people, so they usually don't recognize us collecting their eggs as a threat. However, you should still be cautious as females are still on edge and can be unpredictable. I normally put the eggs into a small container as I collect them so I can get them out of the nest quickly and smoothly. Just as a precaution, try to place the eggs into the container in the same orientation in which they were in the nest. That is, the same side up. Unlike bird eggs, which have to be turned regularly during incubation, reptile eggs should be kept in the same position. It usually isn't an issue if they are temporarily rolled over, as long as they're returned to their original position. Shortly after the eggs are laid, and for around 2 or 3 days afterwards, it doesn't matter which way you place the eggs, but after that, they have to remain in the same position. So it's generally a good idea to err on the side of caution and keep them the same way up regardless. You can either brush loose dirt off the eggs as you collect them, or wait until you transfer them into the egg box. I use an old shaving brush to remove loose dirt. Later, when I'm transferring the eggs from the small container into the egg box in which they'll be incubated, I'll mark the tops of the eggs with a pencil, so I know which way is up throughout incubation. Rather than just put a generic mark, I tend to put a letter denoting which clutch it is, such as clutch A, B, or C, along with a number. I usually number them as I pull them out of the nest, so number 1 is the last one laid and the first one out of the nest. By giving eggs individual numbers rather than a generic mark, if anything happens to a particular egg during incubation, I can add it to my diary and keep track of it. So now we're ready to start incubating the eggs. Well, almost. I did warn you that this video isn't going to go in a tidy chronological order. And to that end, before we start discussing incubation techniques at all, I'm going to go on a fair bit of a tangent to talk about the eggs themselves, as they're the stars of this show, and it's good to have some understanding about them. Some of this may seem random and irrelevant, but most of it has implications for how we incubate them. Long before vertebrates colonized the land, fishes and amphibians laid eggs which required a watery environment in which to survive. Although some recent research has shown that live-bearing and reptiles may be a lot older than we realize, as far as we know, the ability to lay leathery or hard-shelled eggs is what allowed early reptiles to colonize the land. These leathery or hard-shelled eggs contain their own watery environment, so could be laid far from water. Because most of us have grown up eating chicken eggs, and many of us continue to do so as adults, it's easy to take eggs for granted. But when you really think hard about it, eggs are pretty amazing, especially when you look at something like the egg of a large monitor lizard, which can take 9 to 10 months or more to hatch. Imagine this self-contained unit having almost everything it needs to grow a tiny cluster of cells into a miniature version of the adult lizard over almost a year. So a quick recap on the high school biology lesson we've all forgotten. The egg has its own fluid environment, its own food source, its own waste disposal unit, and membranes for exchanging gases or breathing. The shell is semi-permeable, which means that although it can hold the moisture inside, it is also able to let fluids and gases pass back and forth, and this important fact will be brought up a few times in this video, as it will affect how we incubate the eggs. A quick side note here, but something I'll talk more about later. The egg also has antifungal and antibacterial properties. So let's have a quick look at normal development of a monitor egg. Healthy monitor eggs tend to be white, well-rounded rather than dented, and slightly rubbery. Although they are wet when freshly laid, once they've dried off, substrate doesn't stick to them and is easily brushed off. If you try to candle a monitor egg shortly after it is laid, you will not see much. Candling is when you take a small torch or flashlight and put it up against the shell in a dark room. What you're looking for is blood vessels to see if the egg is viable. In some reptiles, the eggs are laid at a reasonably advanced state of development, so blood vessels are readily visible. But with some monitor eggs, especially larger species, blood vessels may not be visible for the first few weeks. As a bit of a side note, you may have noticed that I said viable rather than fertilized. The two words are not interchangeable because eggs can be fertilized and yet still not viable. I often hear people refer to their monitor eggs as not being fertilized or not being fertile. But unless there's no male presence at all, it's hard to know whether or not that is the case, for there are many reasons eggs can be non-viable that have nothing to do with whether or not they were fertilized by a male. And of course, we now know that eggs can sometimes be viable without the presence of a male, in the instances of parthenogenesis. In normal monitor egg development, the egg takes on water as it develops and tends to expand. The embryo needs water to metabolize the yolk. It also needs heat, of course, or it can't metabolize anything at all. If you weigh a monitor egg as it develops, because it is taking on water, it gains weight through most of incubation. But at some point, usually around 80% of the way through incubation, it usually starts to lose weight again. It does this by dumping moisture. Because the leathery shell stretches as the egg grows, but is not elastic, once the egg starts losing moisture, the stretched shell can't shrink back to its original size, so the egg may start to look dented. In this sequence of photographs, we see the same clutch of eggs at different stages of development. Shortly after being laid, the eggs are longish and oval. At 218 days, roughly 80% of the way through incubation, the eggs have swollen with fluid and are now like fat rugby or gridiron balls. At 260 days, shortly before hatching, the eggs have lost a small amount of the fluid that they have gained and are a bit smaller. But wait, you're thinking, didn't I literally just finish telling you that the eggs often dent before hatching? So why aren't any of these eggs dented? Well, that's something I'll be covering later, and it has to do with the incubation technique, as all the photographs I showed you of dented eggs were incubated on substrate, whereas these eggs were suspended over water. But that's something I'll be covering later on. As it turned out, this photograph was taken right before these eggs hatched, as they pipped 3 days later. But I'm getting ahead of myself again, as I'm about to discuss pipping. When it is ready to hatch, the fetus will slit the eggshell with a tiny triangular egg tooth on its front lip, just under the tip of the snout. It may make a single slit and stick the tip of its snout out to breathe, or make several slits. This is called pipping. Once it is pipped, the fetus, now a hatchling, may stay like that for quite a long period of time. There are a few things happening while it is doing this. For starters, now that it is breathing air with its lungs, it is shutting down the blood supply to the egg membranes with which it was breathing during development. If you were to candle a freshly pipped egg, you'd find that the blood vessels are no longer visible as the blood has been drained from them. Here are 2 eggs from the same clutch at the final stages of incubation. The egg on the left, which pipped 2 days later, still had visible blood vessels when it was candled. But when the pipped egg on the right was candled, the blood vessels were no longer visible because the hatchling was breathing air and had drained the blood from the shell membranes with which it was breathing during development. The other reason hatchlings tend to wait for a while before emerging from the egg has to do with the yolk sac. Although the fetus had been using yolk as a food source throughout development, there may be some left in the yolk sac. So after pipping, any yolk in the external yolk sac is abdominalized. The hatchling doesn't want to emerge dragging an external yolk sac around, which can cause all sorts of issues, and I'll go into more detail about external yolk sacs later. Once some of the yolk is abdominalized, this internal yolk reserve provides the hatchling with food for the first week or so after emerging from the egg, so it doesn't have to worry about eating while finding its way around the outside world. And again, I'll talk more about that later. Although, as I've said, the egg is pretty much a self-contained unit, you'll have noticed from my brief description of egg development that there are some things it needs from the environment in order to develop. And these are the important things that we'll need to provide the egg during incubation. First of all, just like adult monitor lizards, a monitor lizard egg needs heat to develop, so we have to provide that. Secondly, the egg needs a source of water in order to metabolize the yolk and grow, which we have to provide through keeping the egg in a moist and/or humid environment. Finally, the egg does breathe, so we'll need to provide air containing oxygen. Tampering with some of these things will affect how the egg develops. We can't tamper with the oxygen-containing air without suffocating the egg, so we'll ignore this bit, but we can fiddle with the heat. And most of you are probably aware that heat has an inverse relationship with incubation time, such that an increase in temperature shortens the time it takes for an egg to hatch. Within reason, of course, because if the eggs are too cool or too hot, this can lead to death and/or deformities. But what about water? Many of you may not be aware that the amount of moisture available also affects incubation time, but in the opposite direction from heat. In other words, the more moisture available to the egg, the longer it takes to incubate. Again, within limits. Too dry and the egg dies, too wet and it will not hatch. If you're interested, there are a number of really interesting papers on the effect of temperature and humidity on monitor eggs, and I'll include a reference to one below the video. But before you get really excited and think you can shorten the whole process by incubating your eggs on the warm and dry side, these things will have an effect on the hatchlings that emerge from the eggs, and I'm going to talk about that later on. So now we know that the eggs need heat, water, and air. Let's have a look at how we provide that. We'll start with heat, which is usually provided by an incubator. As water and air are provided by the egg boxes which go into the incubator, I'll start with the incubator itself, and then later I'll discuss the egg boxes that go inside the incubator. Before we begin to even think about the incubator, the first thing you'll need to consider is where to put your incubator. This may seem like a weird point to ponder, but if you live in a part of the world with a moderate climate in which heating and air conditioning aren't a necessity, the temperature of your house may fluctuate with the weather outside. Where I live in Australia, for example, most houses don't have central heating or air conditioning, which is fine for most of the year. But every now and then, it can get really hot during the day in midsummer, which may cause problems for the eggs you're incubating if it goes on for a long period. For that reason, I usually keep incubators in the coolest part of the house, like a garage or a storage area under the house. Because incubators have their own source of heat, that's their whole point, it's easier to heat an incubator in a cool room than cool an incubator in a hot room. Your average home incubator does not have a means to cool itself down. If your house is temperature controlled and stable, though, you may as well put the incubator in the room in which you keep your reptiles, if they're housed indoors. When it comes to the incubator itself, there are some commercially available models if you wish to buy one, but there are quite simple ways to make an incubator yourself that will last for years without issue. A relatively inexpensive way to make an incubator for monitor eggs, or eggs from any reptile, is to convert an old, disused refrigerator. Refrigerators are good because they are well sealed and have great insulation. Although they're designed to keep cold in and heat out, the insulation works both ways, and they work equally well keeping heat in and cold out. This small bar fridge was the very first incubator I made, and even after I put together a larger incubator later, I continue to use this incubator as well, so it's been in pretty much constant use for over 20 years. You can, if you want, get the refrigeration unit removed to make the whole thing lighter, but before you do that, find out what sort of coolant the fridge was using. for if it is using Freon, you can't just release it into the atmosphere. Freon is damaging to the ozone layer and therefore bad for the environment. So you're well advised to do an online search to find out how to remove it or hire a professional to remove it for you. There are a number of options for heating, and I'll go into some of them with different incubators. For this particular incubator, I installed some light fittings and used 4 low wattage colored incandescent globes. These 15-watt party tone globes were ideal. These days it's getting pretty hard to find incandescent globes, as everything is LED, but you may still find a few around. If you're really struggling to find any, you can also use low wattage ceramic heat emitters. But the advantage to using a colored globe that gives off a bit of light is that you can tell whether or not they're still working instantly, simply by opening the incubator, for they'll slowly turn on to compensate for the cool air entering the incubator. With non-light emitting sources of heat, like ceramic heat emitters, you'd have to get out your temperature gun to check whether or not they're working. I've got 4 globes in here, 2 at the top of the incubator and 2 at the bottom. I did that for 2 reasons. The first being that having 2 above and 2 below provides more even heat, especially as this fridge is too small to put in fans to circulate the warm air. The second reason is that it offers redundancy, which means that if 1 or 2 bulbs burn out, there are still spare working bulbs to keep the incubator warm. So why is it important to have even heat? Because of condensation. This is the first of a couple of conversations I'll be having about condensation. Condensation in an egg box occurs when air outside the egg box is slightly cooler than the air inside the egg box. Warm air can hold more moisture than cool air, so when warm air hits something that causes it to cool down, it dumps some of that moisture. Condensation itself isn't an issue, but if the incubator had bottom heat only, then the egg box may get warmer than the air above it, producing condensation on the inside of the lid of the egg box, which can be a problem, because the condensation will eventually coalesce into larger droplets, which can drop down onto the eggs over time, and this can become fatal for the eggs. With top and bottom heat, this isn't an issue. The next thing we're going to need is a thermostat to control the heat source, and ultimately the temperature. This is usually the most expensive part of a homemade incubator, but it's worthwhile spending some coin to get a decent thermostat. You don't want eggs to fail because you skimped on a thermostat. These days there are some really nice digital thermostats available, but at the time I made this incubator 20-something years ago, the top-of-the-line thermostats look like this. Despite its simplistic-looking design, it has hatched a large number of monitor eggs over the years. And even, more recently, some ostrich eggs. The one thing that made this particular thermostat expensive for its time was that it was a dimming thermostat. What that means is that instead of turning the heat source on and off abruptly, it slowly dims the heat source as it approaches the desired temperature. And then slowly dims it up again as it drops below the desired temperature. If you're going to use light bulbs as a heat source, then you really want a dimming thermostat. When incandescent lights are turned on and off over and over and over again, they lead very short lives and very quickly burn out. But if dimmed down and up rather than a hard on or off, they can last an amazingly long time. I put these 4 cheap party globes in here, which from memory cost me about 75 cents each, over 20 years ago. And despite nearly constant use for 20 plus years, I've only ever had to replace 1 globe. I find the best temperature at which to set the thermostat for monitor eggs is 29.5 to 30 Celsius, which is around 85 to 86 degrees Fahrenheit for the Americans watching this. It's okay if the temperature varies slightly, say it goes up and down a degree or so over a 24-hour period. Good eggs are pretty resilient, and small changes in temperature usually aren't an issue. Even occasional large changes in temperature usually aren't an issue, as long as they don't stay there for long periods. Having said that, you definitely don't want massive heat spikes during the early developmental stages of the eggs. I normally place the thermostat probe either in the center of the back wall of the incubator or under a shelf in the middle of the incubator. Because this old thermostat does not have a built-in thermometer, I put the thermometer probe next to the thermostat probe. Modern digital thermostats have built-in thermometers, so you only need one probe. Some of you may be wondering why I wouldn't suggest putting the probe in the egg box, next to the eggs, since those are the very things for which we are controlling the temperature. This is a bit of a rookie error, and something I would not recommend, but the reason for that is a bit complicated, so I'll try to explain it with an animation. Suppose you have the thermostat set at 30 degrees Celsius, 86 degrees Fahrenheit. You open the door to look at the eggs, and the cool air from the room fills the incubator. The incubator air drops in temperature, let's say to 25 degrees. But because the egg box is sealed, it doesn't drop in temperature that quickly, but stays at 30 degrees for a while. Eventually, though, because the air volume in the incubator is greater than that in the egg box temperature will start to drop. As soon as it gets below the threshold at which you have set the thermostat kicks in and the heat source turns on. The incubator quickly gets back up to 30 degrees. But again, because the egg box is sealed, it takes a while before the thermostat probe picks up on that. In the meantime, the incubator gets warmer and warmer. Eventually, the egg box warms up, and the thermostat dims down again. But it doesn't stop there. Because the incubator is now at a higher temperature than it should be, and again, because the volume of air in the incubator is greater than that of the egg box will slowly heat up until the incubator and egg box reach an equilibrium. However, that equilibrium is at a higher temperature than those eggs should be at. Eventually, the temperature will drop down again. The thermostat will kick in again, and the cycle will start all over, producing spikes in the temperature over time. This probably isn't going to affect the eggs, though, because you followed the instructions in videos 3 and 8 and have perfectly healthy, robust eggs, right? This is what we hope. But you really don't want extra variables while incubating the eggs, so you're better off having the probe in the incubator rather than in the egg box. The incubator itself may go up and down in temperature slightly, but because of the lag, the egg box will be fairly even. And if the incubator is at a mean or average temperature of 30 degrees, the egg box will be at 30 degrees. Getting back to the lights, you may also notice that there is a fifth light globe in there. This one is an LED and is used only for viewing the eggs. It's not on the thermostat and is only switched on manually when the incubator is open to view the eggs. It's really important that if you do install a viewing light, you never forget that you've left it on, for even an LED light produces some heat, and in a well-insulated, contained space like this fridge will eventually produce enough heat to cause an issue for the eggs. I replaced the original shelves in this fridge mainly because they were rusted out, so these ones are made of drilled PVC. However, as I was worried about condensation dripping on the eggs, I've installed small wedges on the shelves so that the egg boxes would be tilted slightly. That way, any condensation forming on the lids of the egg boxes would coalesce towards the front of the egg box and slide down the front wall, which wouldn't be an issue for the eggs. In the end, I overthought this because condensation was never an issue, simply through having heat sources both above and below the egg boxes. If you've got more than one pair of monitors, or even if you have just one pair but they start multi-clutching, you may want a bigger incubator than this little converted bar fridge. My favorite large converted fridge incubators are commercial drinks fridges with glass doors. There are places that refurbish these, and sometimes they get fridges that can't be refurbished, or it's just not worth the time and money to refurbish them, so they'll often offload them for a nominal fee, if not for free. This fridge, for example, cost me $50. Because these fridges are much taller than the bar fridge I showed you earlier, they require a different setup. For starters, you'll want a couple of fans in there to circulate the heat so the incubator is heated evenly. Otherwise, you'll have hotter areas on top than closer to the bottom because heat rises. This may suit you if you're incubating the eggs of a number of different reptiles with different incubation requirements, but for monitors, you'll want to be incubating them all at roughly the same temperature. I put the fans in opposite corners to circulate the air properly. In this instance, one fan is in the front left corner at the top to blow the warm air down, and the other fan is at the back right corner on the bottom to blow the cooler air up. Because of the fans, the heat source and thermostat will have to be different as well, and here's why. For starters, just like the LED light I mentioned earlier, fans produce their own heat, so you can't leave them on full time, or they'll likely quickly overheat the incubator. This means that the fans have to be on the thermostat along with the heat source. But you can't use a dimming thermostat in this case because, unlike incandescent light globes, most fans do not cope with the variable power of a dimming thermostat. They have to be either on or off. This means using an on-off thermostat rather than a dimming thermostat. Or, if your thermostat can do either, just changing the settings on your thermostat. This also means changing your heat source, because you don't want light globes on an on or off thermostat, as they'll burn out in no time. You probably don't want lights as a source of heat in an incubator with a glass front anyway, or the room will look like a nightclub. There are a number of different options for heat sources, though. You can still use light sockets, but have ceramic heat emitters in them instead of light globes. Or you can clip heat cords around the bottom and up and down the corners of the incubator. In this incubator, we've used heat pads at the top and bottom of the incubator, and they've worked really well. These aren't the only ways to make an incubator, of course, for as the saying goes, there are many ways to skin a cat. Some people use eskies, or coolers if you're an American, chili bins if you're from New Zealand. My only concern with these is their relatively small size and lack of thermal stability. Speaking of thermal stability, if you're concerned about electrical blackouts in your area and want to make sure your incubator doesn't drop too much in temperature over several hours, you can add old soda bottles full of water to one or two of the shelves. Once they've warmed up to the temperature of the incubator, they will not cool down as quickly as the air within the incubator. So if the electricity goes off for a few hours, the temperature within the incubator should remain relatively stable. However, even if you don't do this, fridges are pretty well insulated, and as long as you don't open the incubator, it should maintain the temperature for a fair while. So now that we've covered some ideas for a homemade incubator, let's look at the containers in which the eggs themselves are going to be placed before going into the incubator. What I said about the incubator itself also goes for the egg boxes. There are many ways to skin a cat, and if I tried covering every single incubation idea I've ever seen, this video would be too long for anyone to sit through. However, all of the different incubation techniques generally boil down to one of two options: incubation on substrate or a suspension technique. We'll start with incubating on substrate. Exactly as it sounds, incubation on substrate means that the eggs are in contact with some moisture-holding substrate. The two most commonly used substrates are vermiculite and perlite, both of which are commonly available in places that sell gardening supplies. I've also seen people using sphagnum moss, coconut coir, also known as coco peat, and sand. Unless you're experienced with incubating on one of these other substrates, I'd stick to vermiculite or perlite. In fact, I'd probably stick to perlite, as it's a little bit drier to the touch than vermiculite, but the techniques that I'm about to explain with perlite will generally also apply to vermiculite. The reason people use perlite for incubating eggs is because it is inorganic, relatively sterile, and it can hold moisture without being too wet to the touch. Most people will recommend you mix 1 part perlite with 1 part water by weight, but I recommend you go slightly drier than that and mix it at a ratio of roughly 1 part perlite to 0.9 or 0.8 parts water by weight. It has to be by weight, not by volume, or you'll end up with sopping wet perlite, which will be the death of your eggs. Another way to put it is to mix 8 or 9 parts water to 10 parts perlite. Again, by weight. Some people will recommend that you simply soak the perlite and then squeeze out the excess water, but unless you're experienced and know what the proper moisture level feels like, I'd measure out the perlite and water and mix accordingly. I strongly recommend that you wear a mask over your nose and mouth while mixing the perlite and water, possibly even safety goggles, because perlite's really dusty and you could end up coughing like crazy if you don't. A bit of a heads up, if you find a good, consistent source of perlite, you should stick to the same source, as not all perlite is the same. I was using the same perlite for years, and then one day the hardware store from which I was buying it changed brands. The new perlite was a different grade, as in size, and was also a different color. The color itself wasn't important, but it turned out that the color indicated it was already a bit wetter than the normal perlite I used to buy. Perlite tends to go from white to slightly grey when wetted down, but this perlite was already a bit grey to start with. This really stuffed up my incubation technique, as I had to go by feel rather than the normal weights I had been using. Eventually, though, I found another source of perlite, ordered it by bulk, and used that for years, until I changed incubation techniques entirely, which I'll cover later on. You're going to need a container into which to place the perlite and eggs into the incubator. I've always been a big fan of these clip-it containers made by Systema. It's a New Zealand company, but the containers are widely available in grocery stores in Australia and possibly elsewhere. They're great because the lid can be locked into place, and it's sealed with an O-ring. But any plastic Tupperware-style container will suit as long as it is the right size and shape. You want it to be large enough to contain your eggs and deep enough that the eggs aren't touching the top while resting on the perlite. To put the eggs into the perlite, make shallow depressions in the perlite and gently place the eggs in it so they are roughly covered halfway up the sides in perlite. If you haven't already done so as you're taking the eggs out of the nest, mark the tops of the eggs with a pencil so that if the eggs are ever rolled, you can place them right back in their original position. As I mentioned earlier, shortly after the eggs are laid and for around 2 or 3 days afterwards, it doesn't matter which way you place the eggs, but after that they have to remain in the same position, so if they're accidentally rolled, they have to be put upright again. Once you've placed all the eggs, you put the lid on and you're done. But wait, you're thinking, earlier I said that eggs have shell membranes with which they breathe. So how do the eggs breathe if they're sealed in this plastic container? That's simple. I put several large holes into the lid of the container, large enough to allow gas exchange, but not large enough to allow the hatchlings to escape once they hatch. And then cover the container in Glad wrap before sealing the lid into place. I highly recommend using a soldering iron to make the holes, as they make consistently sized, smooth-edged holes with no jagged edges. Notice that I said Glad wrap rather than saran wrap or just sandwich wrap. There's a reason for that. Saran wrap was originally made from polyvinyl chloride, PVDC, which is impervious to oxygen and water. Glad wrap, on the other hand, has always been made from polyethylene, which is impervious to water but allows gas exchange, such as oxygen. In other words, it's breathable, as long as you've got a slow metabolic rate like these reptile eggs. Here's a fun fact: Glad wrap was first invented and developed in Australia. I didn't know that until I started putting together this video. Apparently, saran wrap is now also made from polyethylene because polyvinyl iodine wasn't deemed safe to be in contact with food, But I still tend to use Glad Wrap because, well, I've been working with it for years and I just know that it works at the thickness at which it is sold. And I figure if it ain't broke, why fix it? So that's the substrate incubation method in a nutshell. As I said earlier, I used this technique for years and had excellent hatching success. But it wasn't without its issues, and let's have a look at some of the issues I encountered while using this technique. One of the issues I had with this technique was that hatching times often varied within a clutch. I had eggs from the same clutch in the same egg box pip 45 days apart. You're probably wondering how this could be given that they're all in the same egg box, on the same shelf in the incubator, and at the same temperature. And this is where the effect of moisture on incubation time, which you may recall I had mentioned earlier, comes into play. Eggs kept on a substrate with a higher moisture content take longer to hatch, and conversely, eggs kept slightly drier tend to hatch sooner. So shouldn't all the eggs in the same egg box on the same perlite water mixture be at the same moisture level? Well, it turns out, not necessarily. As you may recall from earlier, condensation forms in the walls of the egg box when there's a disparity in temperature between the interior and exterior of the egg box. This may happen while the egg box is in the incubator because one side of the incubator is near a door with a slight breeze, or it may simply happen because you're really excited about the eggs you're incubating and keep opening the incubator door to peek inside, letting cool air in the process. This isn't an issue, and a bit of condensation on the egg box walls isn't really a problem. However, over time, the water condensing on the sides of the egg box coalesces and slides down the walls and into the substrate, making the substrate closer to the walls higher in moisture than the substrate in the center of the egg box. What sometimes happens is that, over time, the eggs near the center of the egg box start to dent from moisture loss. This in itself isn't an issue, but what it does mean is that the eggs in the center of the egg box are likely to hatch sooner than the fuller eggs closer to the walls. Eggs in the corners of the egg box are getting moisture added to the substrate from two walls, so they become even fuller and will take longer to hatch. Once I figured out why I was getting variable hatch times, I started to swap the eggs around. If I noticed an egg in the center of the egg box denting, I'd swap it around with a fuller egg from one of the corners. As long as you make sure the eggs are marked on top and kept right way up, moving them around isn't an issue. This got rid of my variable hatching times, and I managed to get the entire clutch emerging within a few days of each other. While we're talking about the effect of humidity on incubation time, you may recall that I had mentioned earlier that it's not a good idea to fiddle with heat and humidity to get eggs to hatch earlier. Now's probably a good time to talk about that. You may also recall me mentioning that when hatchlings first pip the eggshell, they often have an external yolk sac, which gets abdominalized. The size of the yolk sac at pipping is determined by the amount of time the fetus has been in the egg living off the yolk. The longer the fetus stays in the egg, using up yolk, the larger the actual fetus will be and the smaller its yolk reserve. If you were to compare two hatchlings, one incubated on the dry side and relatively quickly, the other incubated on the wet side and relatively slowly, they'll probably weigh the same. But one will be a tiny hatchling with a huge belly full of yolk, whereas the other will be a larger hatchling with hardly any abdominal yolk. These large hatchlings tend to be really active almost immediately after hatching, too. Whereas the small hatchlings with large bellies tend to laze around a while after hatching, quite often exhausted by the hatching process itself. So now you're thinking, well, why don't we just incubate the eggs on wet substrate? But there are problems at that extreme too. Eggs that are kept on substrate that is too wet may swell too much during incubation and be unable to pip. What I think is happening here, and this is just a hypothesis, is that the eggs are in direct contact with tiny water droplets in the substrate, which are passing through the eggshell via osmosis. At a time when the egg is meant to be losing water prior to hatching, it struggles to fight against osmosis and is unable to shed the moisture it needs to shed, and the fetus is unable to pip the shell. On the other hand, if an egg is incubated on substrate that is too dry, sometimes it'll be forced to pip so early that it hatches with a huge external yolk sac that it can't internalize in time. So it hatches with the external yolk sac dragging behind it. I'll explain what to do that when this happens later in the video. This need to be in a Goldilocks zone of not too wet but not too dry is another issue I have with incubating on substrate. And of course, there's the issue of dealing with perlite itself. I've coughed my lungs out on so many occasions, I'm surprised I don't suffer from the perlite version of the black lung. And this is where we bring in the second main technique for incubating eggs, the suspension method. With the suspension method, the eggs are not in contact with any substrate. The eggs rest on something, usually a plastic grid, and are suspended in the air, relying entirely on water vapor as their source of water. The eggs can be suspended over just water, but a lot of people like to put something on the bottom of the egg box to stop the water from splashing around when the egg box is moved. That something can be a sponge, some aquarium filter wool, or even the perlite or vermiculite you'd normally use with a substrate method. But this time the eggs aren't in contact with it. I first started thinking about the suspension method after visiting a friend in North Queensland, a well-known reptile breeder who incubated all of his reptile eggs, whether they be pythons or monitors, using the suspension method. He was using these ready-made containers sold in a local supermarket chain, so I decided to experiment with the same containers at first. The containers already have a grid suspended off the bottom. The first step was to use a soldering iron to make holes in the lid. I then took a sheet of PVC and cut out these little shapes with slots and spaced them on the grid to be able to support the eggs off the grid itself. I put the eggs in, then stretched Glad wrap over the top and put the lid back on. Don't worry too much about the PVC separators. Before I made those, I put the eggs straight onto the grid and just used plastic clothes pegs to hold the eggs in place, and that worked fine. You'll notice that when I first started using the suspension method, I was using perlite to hold the water. The horrible grey perlite that pushed me to try the suspension method in the first place, as I still had a lot of it lying around. Eventually I ditched the perlite entirely and started using aquarium filter wool. Coincidentally, around the same time I started experimenting with the suspension method, someone I knew in the US was developing commercial versions of suspension egg boxes called Sims. He sent some over to me and I started experimenting with them as well. Using equipment specifically designed for the purpose tends to be a bonus. I found the suspension method worked for me, extremely well in fact, and I'll outline some of the things I like about it. Probably the best thing about the suspension method is that it's a set up and forget method. I have found that very little fiddling is required during incubation. I'd set the eggs up and then pretty much ignore them until they start pipping many months later. Because the water absorbed is as water vapor and the vapor is distributed evenly throughout the egg box, the corner effect I noticed with the substrate method doesn't seem to happen. This means that all the eggs get approximately the same amount of hydration, so all the eggs tend to pip and hatch within a relatively short period, without me having to swap eggs around. There were a few things that took some getting used to at first. For example, the process of absorbing water as vapor rather than via osmosis from droplets in the substrate seems to take longer. So when the eggs are first set up, there's often a delay before they start showing any signs of swelling. They'll sometimes even sink in a bit and dimple over the first few weeks of incubation before starting to swell. Once I realized this wasn't an issue, I stopped worrying about it. And my advice is to not react and leave them be. If you have them set up correctly, they'll eventually start filling out. But that slow absorption rate and the eggs absorbing water as vapor rather than via osmosis also seems to mean that the eggs have more control over the water intake. This is, again, a hypothesis on my part, but I watched eggs get pretty full and round towards the end of incubation using the suspension method, sometimes to the point that it would have been an issue if they had got that full while incubating on substrate. Yet they were still able to shed enough fluid before hatching to be able to pip and hatch normally. And if you remember from our earlier discussion of the relationship between humidity and incubation time, fuller eggs took longer to hatch for me. But that's not a bad thing, as it means the hatchlings emerge larger and more robust, with smaller yolk reserves. I've also noticed that, unlike with the substrate method, the eggs often don't dent in before hatching when incubated using the suspension method. When I first started using the suspension method, I incubated half of my eggs on substrate and half suspended, just in case. I wanted to hedge my bets. But once I realized the advantages of incubating eggs using the suspension method, I stopped using substrate altogether and incubated all of my eggs using the suspension method. Not only did it require less fiddling and fussing around on my part, to the point I just ignore the eggs for most of their 8 to 9 months plus incubation, but I also didn't have to mix perlite and cough my lungs out. So now that we've looked at a couple of incubation techniques, let's look at some of the things you may encounter during incubation and how you deal with them. One of the questions I often get asked is how to deal with mold. Mold is a pretty generalized term, and it can present itself in many different ways on incubating eggs. It's not uncommon for eggs to develop a light coating of off-white to cream-colored mold that looks a bit like peach fuzz. You may pick up on a slight musty smell when you open the egg box as a result. In my experience, this is not an issue. The mold seems to be living on tiny amounts of substrate on the eggs, or even a residue of dried mucus from when they were laid, but does not seem to affect the eggs at all. The bad news mold is usually colored, slimy, and often has tufts of fuzz that look like cotton. If any of your eggs are covered in mold that falls under that description, there's not a lot you can do about it. Because here's the thing about mold. Mold doesn't kill eggs. It attacks eggs that are already compromised. Getting rid of the mold will not save the eggs. If the mold is only on part of an egg, and the rest of the egg is still relatively clean and whitish, the egg may still be okay. As a general rule, if you're unsure, then keep incubating it until it either smells awful or shrivels up into a tiny mummified nugget. Moldy eggs shouldn't have any effect on the healthy eggs next to them, even if they're touching. Healthy eggs can usually combat mold. To demonstrate how robust healthy reptile eggs can be, have a look at these rough-scaled python eggs. Notice that several of the eggs are healthy and pipping, despite some of them being in direct contact with that really funky, long-dead egg in the upper left corner. That egg was covered in fungus at one stage, yet none of the eggs around it were affected. Aside from mold, the other time you may see eggs discoloring is at the very end of incubation, right before pipping. It's not uncommon for eggs to become patchy looking, often with dark burgundy colored stains. This is usually normal and not something to be alarmed about. It just means the eggs are getting ready to hatch. The eggshell will often change in texture right before hatching, usually after it has started to discolor. Eggs that are about to hatch often get really soft on top and even the sides, feeling like soft parchment paper. This means pipping is imminent. Once the egg softens, it usually pips the next day or two. Okay, so what happens when an egg discolors and gets soft, but doesn't pip? Or all the other eggs have hatched, and there's still one remaining in the egg box doing nothing. At what point should you consider cutting the egg to let the hatchling out? And that's an easy one to answer. Never. Eggs will either hatch or they will not. Cutting an egg will, at best, leave you with a fetus not quite ready to hatch, which has a large external yolk sac that you'll probably have to remove to avoid infection, compromising the hatchling. At worst, it will leave you with an underdeveloped fetus that is nowhere near ready to hatch and will slowly die. No good can come out of cutting eggs. Modulars have been laying eggs and hatching out of them for millions of years, and we humans have only been incubating their eggs for a few decades. They know what they're doing, and we need to trust that process. This also applies to hatchlings that have pipped and have either their snout or head out of the egg, but still haven't come out of the egg themselves, after what seems like a really long time. In my opinion, you should just leave them be. It can sometimes take a couple of days before they're ready to emerge. As I had mentioned earlier, they've got a lot going on right then, and they're just waiting for a number of processes to occur before they leave the egg. One of the things you'll immediately notice when a hatchling does emerge is how huge they are relative to the size of the egg. It doesn't seem possible that they could fit in there at all. Towards the very end of incubation, the fetus fills up all the available space and is curled up like a contortionist. Sometimes after pipping, the hatchling's arm, leg, or tail will pop out after they've slit the egg with their egg tooth. And that's quite common as well. But despite the fetus filling up most of the egg, if you were to try to candle an egg really late in incubation, it looks as though the egg is filled with fluid, with the fetus only taking up a relatively small portion of the volume, near the bottom. What I think is happening here is refraction and diffusion. The light waves bend around the solid objects, not dissimilar to what happens when you put your fingers against a torch or flashlight and it looks like you have no bones in your fingers. When the hatchling eventually emerges, it may occasionally still have an external yolk sac after leaving the egg, despite all the efforts you've taken to avoid that. There are two schools of thought as to what to do about this. Some people think you should try to keep the hatchling as clean as possible and let it absorb or internalize the yolk. I'm of the belief that you need to remove it as soon as possible, as it's extremely difficult to prevent infection, and once bacteria take over the yolk sac, they can travel via the umbilicus to the yolk in the hatchling's abdomen, and that is really tricky to deal with. If the yolk has already started moving up the umbilicus, and the umbilicus is wide where it meets the abdomen, you're better off leaving it until it internalizes. But if the yolk sac is still quite separate, and there's just a thin umbilicus separating it from the hatchling's abdomen, then get a thick piece of thread or even dental floss, tie off the umbilicus close to the hatchling's abdomen, and then sever the umbilicus on the far side of the knot from the abdomen. Get a clean plastic container or an empty egg box, put some air holes in the lid and some dry paper towel on the bottom, and then put the hatchling in there, and put the box back in the incubator for a day or so. The umbilicus will dry off. You can give the hatchling some water to drink by filling a plastic jar lid or something similar with water. It's often not a bad idea to put all hatchlings in a separate dry container in the incubator for a day or two before putting them into their raise-up enclosure. It gives the umbilical scars a chance to heal a bit more and also gives the hatchling a chance to get their energy back after hatching, especially if they're incubated on substrate and are still exhausted. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video and the monitor breeding series as a whole. Although I've finished this series, I'm not going to stop producing content, so if you haven't already subscribed, please do so now. Turn notifications on. Until then, cheers.